What if I told you that in the spring of 1945, when the war in Europe was ending, the German Reichsbank was sitting on a pile of gold so massive it would stretch, bar after bar, for the length of several football fields, and that within weeks, almost none of it would be where it was supposed to be? Stay with me because this story is stranger than any thriller, and it all starts not with a heist, but with a vault. Friends, today we are cracking open the very first layer of one of the biggest financial mysteries of the 20th century. The Reich gold file. 500 tons that supposedly vanished in the spring of 1945. Where did it go? Who touched it? Who covered it up? And how much of it is still out there, somewhere, waiting to be counted? But before we chase any treasure, we have to do something boring. We have to count the gold that was actually real, because that is where the story begins to twist. There's an old saying among miners that you cannot find what was never in the ground. The same is true of missing treasure. If a story tells you that 500 tons vanished, first ask how many tons were ever there to begin with. Quick note before we go further. If you love these slow-burn detective stories where the truth hides in plain sight, hit subscribe and ring that little bell, because over the next weeks, we're going to tear this mystery apart, piece by piece. Now, to the heart of it. In April of 1945, the Allied forces rolled into a broken Germany. The Third Army, the American one, with its tanks and engineers, was not just hunting soldiers. There was a second army inside the army, made of accountants, bankers, and intelligence officers. Their job was to find the gold before it disappeared into the rubble, into secret tunnels, into Swiss accounts, into the myths that were already being born. When they finally consolidated what they had found across the smashed vaults of Berlin, the number they wrote down was roughly 3,380 tons of foreign gold. That is not the total gold of Germany. That is only the foreign gold sitting in the Reichsbank system, gold that had been looted from the central banks of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Greece, mixed in with what the Germans had brought in from before the war. 3,380 tons is a number worth pausing on. That is more than 800 million troy ounces if you do the math in your head. It is a quantity so large that it is almost impossible to picture. But here is where the first lie begins. The Nazi leadership, even as the bombs were falling, was busy building a story. The story went like this. The Reichsbank gold had been evacuated months before the fall of Berlin. It was hidden in a salt mine near a little town called Merkers, deep in the German heartland, in Thuringia. Some versions said it was in Erfurt. Some versions said it was somewhere else entirely. A man named Friedrich Wilhelm Kranefuss, the vice president of the Reichsbank, was rumored to have signed the evacuation order himself. Walther Funk, the president of the bank, told conflicting stories under interrogation. Emil Pohl, another vice president, told different ones. Even Heinrich Himmler, the most powerful man in the SS, gave testimony that contradicted itself depending on which month you caught him in. So before any treasure hunters even started digging, the Germans had already started muddying the water. The story of the Reich gold begins with a lie told by the losers, and that lie has been growing ever since. Then came April 8th, 1945. The American 90th Infantry Division was pushing through central Germany when scouts reported something strange near the Merkers salt mine. Local citizens were walking into the mine, carrying sacks of cash and gold objects, trying to hide their personal savings from the advancing army. The Americans followed them underground. What they found took their breath away. Rows and rows of shelves, stretching deep into the tunnels, lined with gold bars. Currency from a dozen countries. Painted plaster reproductions of famous artworks that the Nazis had stolen from museums across Europe. And a smaller, stranger cache known as the Fraternal Treasure, a special fund controlled by the SS, full of gold teeth, gold wedding rings, eyeglasses, and other items taken from the victims of the concentration camps. General Charles Reiter, a one-armed American brigadier, walked through the tunnel with a flashlight and a camera. The photograph of him and his officers staring at the bars became one of the most reproduced images of the post-war years. And in 1946, the United States Senate held what were called the Nazi gold hearings, led by a senator named Kilgore, trying to figure out how much of his treasure had already been moved before the Allies even arrived. But the Merkers discovery was only the visible tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, the SS had been running its own private gold operation for years. It was called the Melmeer Operation, named after a man named Carl Friedrich von Eberstein who ran the office that processed the flow. Every month, suitcases full of gold, dollars, and foreign currency arrived at SS headquarters. They were laundered through Swiss banks, through offshore accounts, through clearing houses that knew exactly what they were handling but never asked too many questions. The whole thing was managed by an SS economic empire called the WVHA, run by a man named Oswald Pohl. To the SS, the gold of the Reich was not just a piggy bank. It was a getaway fund, a backup plan, an escape route for a regime that already saw the writing on the wall. And then something happened that almost nobody talks about in the usual tellings of this story. In February of 1996, the Bank for International Settlements, a quiet little institution in Basel, Switzerland, known as the BIS, transferred roughly 94 tons of gold worth about 540 million Deutsche Mark to the Bank of England in London. The transfer happened over a single weekend when the BIS staff was thin. The story broke in 1997, and an internal report followed, but the details were largely buried. The man who was running the BS at the time, Andrew Crockett, had to answer very uncomfortable questions. The episode is a perfect example of how the Reich gold file never really closed. It just keeps leaking decade after decade. So where does the famous 500 tons come from? The number is a wild guess built on top of another wild guess. In 1998, a special committee of experts, led by a former Federal Reserve chairman named Paul Volcker, tried to reconcile all the figures from all the different investigations. The American State Department had published the Eizenstat report in stages between 1997 and 2006. The original tripartite gold commission, set up in 1946 by the Allies, had spent 50 years slowly cataloging what it could. The Volcker Committee added up the physical gold recovered, the gold accounted for, the gold swapped, the gold melted down, and the gold that simply disappeared into the system. The result was a number they called unallocated. That gap between the gold that was once measured and the gold that can now be located is where the 500 tons lives. But the truth is messier than a single number. Some of it was stolen by the Soviets and recast in Moscow. Some of it was quietly folded into the reserves of Western European central banks. Some of it was used to pay off American and British intelligence operations. Some of it was melted down and poured into bars with no markings, becoming indistinguishable from any other gold on Earth. In the next part, we will follow those bars out of the Reich through Swiss bank vaults, through Vatican channels, through Iberian ports, through Alpine caches, and into the hands of the men who thought they would outlive the war. We will meet SS generals, secret bankers, Vatican bishops, and the bizarre cast of characters who each grabbed their own slice of the disappearing fortune. For now, just remember this. The Reich gold story is not a treasure hunt. It is a story about what happens to a country when the people in charge decide that some wealth should never be found. And the first step in any honest investigation is not to chase the bars. It is to count the ones we know existed, the ones we know were recovered, and the difference between those two numbers. That difference is where history was rewritten. And that is exactly where we're going next. Tap the bell, and I will see you in part 2. The gold did not vanish in a single moment. It trickled out in 100 different directions, through 100 different hands, in the last 18 months of the war, and the people who moved it had been planning their escape long before the first Allied boot touched French soil. Picture, if you will, a spider web. Now imagine that the spider at the center is not one person, but a small committee of Nazi officials, SS officers, industrialists, and bankers, each with his own bank account, his own contacts, his own private runway. They did not trust each other. They did not even particularly like each other. But they all understood that when the war ended, the winners would come looking for every gram of metal they could find. So each of them built his own little escape tunnel. The first and most famous tunnel ran through Switzerland. In the early months of 1944, even as the Germans were still retreating on the Eastern Front, a quiet operation was already underway. The Germans called it Sauberung, which is a German word that means cleaning or purification, and the file was labeled Operation 7. Under this program, Reichsbank gold was being systematically transferred into the vaults of the Swiss National Bank in Zurich and Bern, and into the private vaults of three major Swiss commercial banks, Credit Suisse, the Schweizerische Bankgesellschaft, and the Schweizerische Bankverein. By the end of the war, historians estimate roughly 1,260 tons of gold had passed through Switzerland in one form or another. Some of that gold was legitimate. Some of it had been melted and recast so many times that even the Swiss bankers could no longer tell whose it had originally been. The man who made much of this possible was a Reichsbank director named Hayes, whose name later appeared in the files of the Bergier Commission, the independent Swiss investigation that finally, in the late 1990s, tried to put honest numbers on what Swiss banks had done during the war. The Commission's findings were published in 2002, and they were uncomfortable reading for a country that liked to think of itself as neutral. But Switzerland was only one exit door. There were others. Through the Vatican, a curious little stream of assets flowed southward into Italy. A bishop named Alois Hudel, an Austrian with sympathetic ears for the Nazi cause, helped arrange passage for gold belonging to the Croatian Ustasha regime and for valuables smuggled out of Hungary by the Arrow Cross fascists. Some of this wealth ended up in accounts at the Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Istituto per l'Opere Religiose, or IOR. Some of it was stored in a monastery called Santa Bona, in Tuscany, where monks had learned not to ask too many questions about unmarked suitcases arriving in the middle of the night. In 1944, an Italian financier named Baron Luigi Perilli met with an American intelligence officer named Alan Dulles in the Swiss capital of Bern. Dulles was already the OSS station chief in Switzerland. Perilli was shopping information about hidden Reich assets. The conversation was one of the earliest documented Cold War trades, and it set the pattern for how recovered Nazi wealth would be used as a bargaining chip for decades afterward. Out through the Iberian ports, another stream flowed. Portugal and Spain, ruled by Salazar and Franco, had been quietly trading German gold for tungsten, a metal essential for making tank armor and machine tools. The exchanges were handled by shadowy intermediaries, a German named Walter Reich and a Portuguese fixer named Carlos Fernandes, both of whom operated out of Lisbon. The actual bank records, when they were finally pried loose from Portuguese and Spanish archives, showed that much of this gold had been laundered through accounts belonging to a German-Swiss industrialist named Carlos Cabal Mejia, whose name appears on transactions across 3 continents. By the time the war ended, the tungsten for gold pipeline had been running for so long that almost no one could say with certainty whose metal was sitting in whose vault. Then there were the mountains. In the last desperate months of the war, the SS, the Reichsbank, and various party officials began burying caches across Austria, Bavaria, and the Bohemian region of what was then Czechoslovakia. The Americans later identified a system they called the Tübingen-Koblenz-Salzburg Cache Network, a series of secret deposits reported by counterintelligence corps officers between 1945 and 1947. The Nazis are believed to have maintained a top-secret map of these deposits, sometimes called Map 31 or the Figure 31 Cardi. American intelligence officers spent years chasing rumors of this map, and some of them believed they came close to finding it. The investigation became known internally as the Monster Case, and it was the largest counterespionage operation ever undertaken by the United States Army in Europe. The files were finally declassified in 2018, and they paint a picture of frantic, almost chaotic effort as SS convoys raced across collapsing roads in the last weeks of the war, dumping gold and currency into lakes, caves, and abandoned mine shafts. In Bohemia, there's a small town called Bresnitz, which the Germans called Wadnian. Witnesses have long claimed that a Reichsbank train was parked near the Moldau River in late April of 1945, and that some of its cargo was transferred into the local countryside under SS guard. The exact fate of that train is still debated. Some researchers believe it was overrun by American forces. Others believe its contents were taken east toward the advancing Soviet lines. That eastern route is where the story grows darkest. In 1944, the Hungarian government, under its regent Miklós Horthy, attempted to flee its alliance with Germany. As part of that escape, the Hungarian National Bank transferred much of its gold reserves to the Reichsbank for safekeeping. When the Germans invaded Hungary in March of 1945, the Arrow-Cross regime took power, and some of that gold was redirected into SS hands. By the time Soviet troops entered Budapest, the gold had become a prize of war. Soviet SMERSH teams, special military intelligence units, systematically stripped whatever Reich assets they could find in Saxony, in the Sudetenland, and across the territories they occupied. The SMERSH officer most often associated with the recovery was General Georgy Sviridov. The gold he shipped east was supposed to be carefully documented. Decades later, in 1985, during the era of Mikhail Gorbachev, Moscow quietly admitted that much of the recovered bullion had been melted and recast in a standard Soviet bars, erasing every trace of its previous ownership. Then there were the industrial partners. The vast German chemical concern IG Farben and the Dresdner Bank, which had been closely tied to the Nazi regime, both operated parallel networks for relocating wealth. Hjalmar Schacht, the former Reichsbank president who had been Hitler's banker before falling out of favor, maintained his own quiet channels. After the war, many of these structures survived almost unchanged inside the new West German banking system. The men who had run them simply took off their Nazi uniforms and put on gray business suits. In the very last days of April 1945, with Berlin already in ruins, a shadow government was formed in the northern German town of Flensburg under Admiral Karl Donitz, the man Hitler had named as his successor. This rump cabinet, sometimes called the Flensburg government, attempted one last piece of business, protecting what remained of the Reich's wealth under a program insiders called Banner of the Reich. On May 1st, 1945, the day Hitler died in his bunker, Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, fled Berlin in an unknown direction. Some historians believe he was carrying documents that listed the location of hidden caches. Others believe he was simply running for his life. The truth has never been established. And behind all of these movements stood a strange cast of characters. SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer captured after the war, knew more about hidden assets than almost anyone alive, and he told very little. SS Standartenführer Walter Schellenberg, the chief of foreign intelligence, had his own private caches and his own private contacts in neutral countries. A Wehrmacht general named Hans Speidel, whose loyalties were deeply ambiguous, would later reappear as a senior officer in the new West German army, and rumors about his wartime role in asset protection have never quite gone away. What emerges, when you lay all of these pieces side by side, is not the story of one heist, but the story of 100 small thefts, each one planned by men who had been trained to believe that preparation was everything. They had Swiss bank accounts ready. They had Vatican contacts ready. They had Iberian warehouses ready. They had Alpine caves ready. They had Soviet intermediaries ready. And because each group acted independently, none of them ever knew the full picture of where the gold actually went. That is why the famous 500 tons is so hard to pin down. It is not one single fortune that walked out the door. It is a fog of smaller fortunes, each one carried by a different messenger, each one hidden in a different place, each one covered by a different lie. The job of the historian and the job of the detective is to follow each thread until the fog begins to lift. In the next part, we will turn the camera around and look at the men who came to collect what was left. The Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets each had their own recovery teams, their own secret agendas, and their own reasons to keep some of what they found far away from any public ledger. When the guns stopped firing, the real war for the gold began. And it was not fought by soldiers. It was fought by accountants, intelligence officers, lawyers, and diplomats, all of them working behind closed doors, all of them carrying sealed folders stamped with words like secret, restricted, and eyes only. Let me take you inside that war because it is the part of the story that most treasure hunters ignore, and it is the part that explains why the famous number of 500 missing tons has survived for 80 years. The Americans were the first to organize themselves. Inside the United States Army, alongside the combat divisions, sat a smaller, quieter unit called the SHEF Finance Division. SHAEF stood for Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Its job was to follow the front lines and seize anything that looked like enemy wealth. But the American operation went far beyond simple seizure. There was a program called Operation Paperclip, the better-known effort to recruit German scientists for the American war effort. And there was its lesser-known twin, a program the Army called Operation Lusty, which stood for Luftwaffe's secret technology. Together, these programs did not just collect rocket blueprints and jet engine designs. They also collected gold bars, currency reserves, and the personal fortunes of German industrialists who were useful to the new American empire being born in the post-war years. Some of that recovered gold was used, quietly, to underwrite the reserve component of the Marshall Plan, the American program to rebuild Western Europe. The connection between Nazi bullion and American foreign aid was never announced publicly, but it appeared in internal Treasury memos that were declassified decades later. A man named Herbert R. Askin, working for the United States Treasury, helped trace the flow. Another officer, Colonel Bernard Bernstein of the Army's Financial Investigation Unit, kept meticulous records. Both of them understood that the gold was not just treasure. It was leverage. The British ran their own parallel operation. The Bank of England had close ties to the Reichsbank going back to the 1920s, when a legendary figure named Montague Norman had governed British monetary policy as if he personally owned the place. In the post-war years, those old networks came in handy. There was a British effort called Operation Unicorn, focused on evacuating German industrial assets from the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Western Germany, into the British occupation zone. There was also an effort called Operation Surprise, which handled the more sensitive financial matters. Sir Stafford Cripps, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was the political figure most often associated with these decisions. Britain was broke after the war, and the temptation to keep a portion of the recovered gold was strong. Internal documents later suggested that somewhere between 20 and 80 million pounds in gold bars quietly stayed in British hands, never to be returned to any central bank or any victim family. The Soviets played the game differently, and they played it most aggressively of all. Soviet SMERSH teams, the military intelligence units that operated under Stalin's personal control, swept through Saxony, through the Sudetenland, and through every region their troops occupied. They did not file paperwork. They did not hold hearings. They took what they found and shipped it east. The officer most associated with this effort was General Georgy Sverdlov, whose name appears in Soviet archives alongside crates of gold bars, paintings, and other valuables. By the early 1950s, Moscow had accumulated a substantial cache of what it called war trophies. For 40 years, the Kremlin refused to acknowledge what it had taken. Then, in 1985, during the era of Mikhail Gorbachev, a partial admission was made. Officials confirmed that much of the recovered bullion had been melted and recast into standard Soviet bars. The markings were gone. The chain of custody was erased. The gold had been laundered, but not by Swiss bankers, by the government of a country that presented itself as the enemy of fascism. The French had their own complicated story. Paris had been a major victim of German looting. The Banque de France and the Banque d'Algerie had lost enormous reserves to the Reich. After liberation, the French government, under Charles de Gaulle, demanded the return of every gram. But Washington and London dragged their feet, and a quiet dispute dragged on through the late 1940s. Some of the French gold was returned. Some was absorbed into American and British reserves to compensate for what the French government had failed to recover independently. The political fight over French gold poisoned relations between the Allies for years. To manage the mess, the three Western allies and roughly a dozen victim states set up a body called the Tripartite Gold Commission. It was created by the Paris Agreement on Reparations in 1946. For more than 50 years, this commission met in slow, dusty sessions, trying to distinguish between what it called monetary gold, meaning gold that had been Reichsbank reserves, and what it called non-monetary gold, meaning gold that had been looted from private citizens or from victim central banks. The commission slowly allocated recovered gold to the countries that could prove their losses. Roughly 540 tons of gold were officially allocated to the Soviet Union under this process. Whether Moscow actually received those bars, or whether it had already taken its share and was now demanding more, remained a question nobody wanted to answer out loud. The political weather changed in 1947 when President Harry Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. From that moment on, restitution was no longer the priority. The priority was containing Soviet influence. West Germany, the future Federal Republic, was now an ally, not an enemy. And in 1953, the London Agreement on German external debts effectively closed the door on most restitution claims. Victim families, victim governments, victim central banks were told that the file was now considered settled. Many of them had never been fully consulted. Meanwhile, Switzerland was being forced to confront its own past. In 1946, the Washington Accord settled Switzerland's restitution liability at a figure of 250 million Swiss francs. That number was a fraction of what the country had actually handled. The man who had run the American intelligence operation in Switzerland during the war, Allen Dulles, went on to become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. His wartime relationships with Swiss bankers remained a sensitive topic for decades. It was not until the late 1990s that the Bergier Commission, an independent Swiss inquiry, finally tried to quantify what had really happened. Its report, published in 2002, confirmed that Swiss banks had knowingly handled looted gold on a massive scale. The Vatican was harder to pin down. After the war, investigators tried to trace assets that had passed through the Vatican Bank, the Istituto per lo Opere Religiose, and through monasteries like Santa Bona in Tuscany. The Croatian Ustasha gold and the Hungarian Arrow Cross gold were the most documented flows. In 2001, the Vatican Apostolic Archive published a partial accounting of wartime accounts, but the response was muted. Many victim governments felt that the picture was still incomplete. So when you put all of this together, what you see is not a simple story of recovery. You see a story of managed amnesia. The Americans kept some. The British kept some. The Soviets kept most of what they seized and erased the evidence. The Swiss paid a small fine. The Vatican issued a partial report. And the victims, the families, the governments, the central banks that had lost everything were told politely that the matter was closed. The matter was not closed. The matter was just no longer convenient. 80 years. That is how long this story has been unfolding. And the strange thing is that the most interesting part of it is happening right now. In quiet rooms full of archivists, in courtrooms you have probably never heard of, and in Bavarian foothills where a man with a ground-penetrating radar is slowly walking across a meadow that nobody bothered to look at before. Let me take you into that modern chapter, because it is the one that tells us whether the famous 500 tons was ever really a number at all, or whether it was always just a placeholder for a much more interesting truth. In the late 1990s, a committee of serious people, including a former chairman of the United States Federal Reserve named Paul Volcker, was asked to do something almost impossible. They were asked to take every scrap of documentation from every previous investigation, every archive in every country, every ledger in every bank that could be pried open, and to add it all up. They published their work in 1998, and the headline number was a small one. Roughly 5,300 gold bars were still sitting somewhere inside the accounts of the bank for international settlements, officially unallocated. That is a real number. It is also a small number when you compare it to the 3,380 tons that the Allies originally documented. Unallocated, in the language of central banking, does not mean missing. It means that the paperwork cannot prove, beyond doubt, which original owner the bars belong to, and therefore the bars stay in a kind of legal limbo, administered by the BAS, waiting for someone to come forward with a credible claim. That committee was not the last word. In 2018, the United States National Archives at College Park released hundreds of pages from what investigators had always called the monster case, the largest counterespionage investigation ever run by the United States Army in Europe. The files have been sealed since the late 1940s, and when they finally came out, they told the story of a young SS officer named Karl Zech-Prellwitzer, who had been put in charge of a gold convoy in the last weeks of the war. According to the documents, his convoy carried somewhere between 28 and 50 tons of gold bars across the Austrian Alps, through the Torn region, past Lake Toplitz. The convoy was never recovered. American intelligence officers spent years chasing rumors of its route. Some of them came close. None of them closed a file. The declassified papers do not solve the mystery. They simply confirm that the mystery was always more than a campfire story. Speaking of Lake Toplitz, because every story about Nazi treasure eventually wanders there, let me tell you what is actually at the bottom of that lake. In 1959, an Austrian engineer named Hans Frick led an expedition into the cold, black water. He found wooden boxes. Inside the boxes were not gold bars. They were bundles of forged British pound notes, carefully printed by the SS in case they needed to flood the British economy after a German victory. In 1983, a German named Werner Wolf tried again and failed. In 2004, a marine archaeologist named Christian Mittermeier ran a more modern survey, and what he found was a library of historical documents and personal letters, the kind of archive that researchers had once hoped would include a treasure map, but that turned out to be a window into the daily life of the last Nazi holdouts. The lake is real. The mystery around it is real, but the gold is not there. The lake is, in its own way, a monument to Nazi disinformation, because the story of what was supposedly hidden in it has done more to obscure the truth than any document the Reich ever printed. There are still court cases moving through the system today. In Washington, lawyers representing the heirs of the Hungarian, Greek, and Czech central banks have spent decades arguing that bars recovered by the tripartite gold commission were not fairly allocated. A line of cases known as the Deutsch versus Lockheische proceedings has wound its way through American and European courts. The Greek government filed a claim against the Deutsche Bundesbank as recently as 2010, arguing that gold extracted from the Bank of Greece during the occupation had never been properly returned. None of these cases have produced dramatic courtroom revelations. What they have produced, slowly, is a body of legal precedent that makes it harder and harder for any institution to claim that the file is closed. Russia, for its part, made a partial disclosure in 1992 when the Russian State Archives released a thin inventory of what Soviet trophy brigades had taken. The number that keeps surfacing in the press is roughly 193 tons of gold supposedly held in a special Kremlin fund. But no independent researcher has ever been allowed inside the vault to verify the figure. The Russian position has always been that the Soviet Union suffered more than any other nation, that it paid the highest price in blood, and that whatever it took was simply compensation for what it had lost. That argument has its own logic. It is also, by design, almost impossible to audit. Germany itself has been doing something quietly remarkable. In 2020, the Deutsche Bundesbank established a service center dedicated to provenance research, a small unit of historians and archivists whose job is to trace the ownership history of every bar that comes through the bank. In 2022, the German federal government published a comprehensive report on wartime restitution. It did not reveal any hidden trove. What it did was create a public, searchable database that any researcher, any lawyer, any descendant of a victim can use to follow the trail. That is not glamorous work. It is the kind of work that actually changes the shape of a historical mystery because it replaces speculation with documents. And then there are the treasure hunters, the real ones, the kind you do not see on reality television. In the Bavarian foothills, a small community of professional researchers has been using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry to scan meadows, forest floors, and the ruins of old farmhouses. In 2022, a cache associated with the family of Claus von Stauffenberg was examined using these methods, not because anyone believed gold would be found, but because the same technology that locates buried pipes can also locate buried boxes. In 2023, a small collection of Nazi-era documents surfaced near the Tolzer land. None of this is cinematic. None of it produces a satisfying final scene. But cumulatively, it is shrinking the search radius year by year in a way that no dramatic expedition ever could. So where does this leave us, 80 years on, with the famous 500 tons? The honest answer is that most of the Reich gold that ever existed has been melted, recast, and integrated into the official bullion reserves of central banks around the world. The substance still exists. The chain of custody does not. A small portion, probably less than 5% of the original missing estimate, is genuinely unaccounted for. It sits in some combination of three places. It sits in BS accounts as unallocated bars waiting for a claimant. It sits in the unresolved documents of the monster case, pointing toward Alpine convoys that were never recovered. And it sits, possibly, in the ground itself, in caches that have not yet been found and may never be found, because the men who buried them are long dead and the maps they drew are often burned, lost, or stolen. But here is the deeper truth, the one that matters more than any number. The Reich gold mystery was never really about gold. It was about the architecture of post-war silence, the way for occupying powers, several neutral states, and a global financial system agreed, formally or informally, that some questions were not worth answering in public. The investigations of the last 80 years have not been treasure hunts. They have been slow, stubborn attempts to restore a documentary trail that powerful institutions preferred to leave broken. And the reason the file keeps getting reopened decade after decade is not that someone believes a mountain of bars is waiting to be discovered. The reason is that every time a new archive is opened, every time a court forces a disclosure, every time a provenance researcher traces one more bar back to its original owner, the architecture of that silence gets a little weaker. The story is not over. It has simply changed what it is investigating. The chase has moved from caves to filing cabinets, from ground-penetrating radar to database queries, from dramatic expeditions to patient legal arguments. And that, in its own way, is the most interesting part of the whole saga, because it tells us something about how historical truth actually gets recovered. Not in a single heroic moment, not with a single spectacular find, but slowly, document by document, case by case, until the picture becomes clearer than any single person ever intended it to be. If you stayed with me through this whole series, thank you. You are exactly the kind of curious mind that keeps these questions alive. Subscribe, share with a friend who loves a good mystery, and I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and keep asking the questions that nobody else wants to answer.